Hi everybody, and welcome back to our ongoing discussion of fundamentals in epistemology. Now today, what I want to discuss are basic axioms, and specifically, I want to show where they come from, how they allow us to build knowledge, and how people tend to misuse their application. As I keep trying to emphasize on this channel, the whole idea of a rational public debate is worthless if, at some level, we cannot even agree on what the rules of debate are supposed to be. Now, this is important because a lot of people seem to think that they know the rules intuitively, when in reality, virtually no one ever seems to actually sit down and just write them out for what they are. So hopefully this discussion will help to clear up some of the confusion and maybe allow people to understand how to properly utilize axioms toward a functional understanding of the world. But before jumping right into that, let's do a quick review of what we talked about in the previous two videos. Remember that there's a distinction between reality, our perceptions of reality, and then our linguistic framework for describing reality. We also talked about how truth is not some platonic essence of the universe, but simply a label that we assign to propositions. We then talked about how there's no such thing as a universal epistemology in the strictest sense, but that pragmatism does at least satisfy many common human interests. I have beliefs, those beliefs are used to inform my decisions, and those decisions eventually lead to consequences. So in some way or another, true beliefs have to be measured by their capacity to generate predictable outcomes. All that remains now is to just sit down and enumerate a clear set of rules that allow us to objectively gauge matters of fact with that pragmatic goal in mind. Alright, so that being said, let's get right into it. So our first axiom is going to say, all consistent axioms are true. Now, why would I need this as an axiom? What function does it serve? Because at face value, it almost seems a little circular. But I can assure you that there's a very specific reason why we need this. Now remember that an epistemology is just a set of rules that assigns truth to propositions. However, those very rules are themselves going to have to exist in the form of propositions as well. So when you hand me an axiom, I need to give it a truth value. So what am I going to pick? Are axioms going to be true or maybe false, or do they just float outside in some kind of alternative third category? Well, obviously, I'd like for them to go somewhere, so it seems pretty natural that they should go into the true bucket. Now, some may try and argue that this is blatant circular reasoning. I mean, if I get to simply state point blank that a bunch of arbitrary axioms are true, well then what's to stop other people from stating point blank that God's existence is just another true axiom? And that's a good question, but the key distinction here is that I'm not saying anything at all about the external world. That's not what an axiom is for. Rather, what I am stating is really tantamount to little more than a definition. I mean, again, an epistemology is like a black box where propositions get stuffed in on one end and then truth declarations pop out of the other. Axioms are then simply rules that define the algorithm contained within that box. And all this particular rule says is that the rules themselves deserve a true label. I mean, after all, I have to give them some label, don't I? And it doesn't make much sense to just leave them floating outside of the epistemic system on their own. And obviously, I'm going to need my axioms if I'm ever going to make use of an epistemic system. So therefore, my axioms need to be true. So no, I'm sorry, but you don't get to just assert God's existence as axiomatic truth. That is not what axioms do. Axioms simply define rules, not what is or is not out there in the external world. That, in fact, would be circular reasoning, while this is simply a matter of closure. Alright, moving along, our second axiom simply says, all incorrigible propositions are true. Now, an incorrigible proposition is merely an honest statement of some kind of sensory perception or mental awareness. For example, I see red would be an incorrigible proposition. It's simply me giving words to my immediate internal perception. And again, that immediate awareness is going to serve as the ultimate basis for every decision I ever hope to make. So as long as I'm not lying to myself, then I want this awareness to have its own epistemic label. And since I cannot deny the plain awareness before me, I'm just going to simply take it all for what it is and label it all as being true. Now, it's important to realize the limitations of what an incorrigible proposition can tell me. So, for example, if I were to say, I hear music, then that statement would be axiomatically true by incorrigibility. But notice how that doesn't actually tell me anything about where the music is really coming from or what is causing it. For example, maybe there's a band playing nearby, or maybe I'm hearing a radio. Maybe I'm mistaking the wind through trees, or maybe I'm just hallucinating outright. Who knows? Just because I hear music, that does not really mean I know anything about the absolute nature of whatever is going on in external reality. All it says is that I have a unique awareness at this moment, and it is called music. So therefore, it is true that I hear music. With that in mind, think about how Christians have historically tried to abuse this sort of axiom. For instance, one of their most popular claims might sound like, I know God exists because I feel God in my heart. Or maybe they've experienced the self-authenticating witness of the Holy Spirit. Christians love these kinds of statements because they attempt to reduce God's existence to an incorrigible awareness that literally cannot be wrong. But when you understand what's being said, you can see how this is just a fallacy. And when you claim to feel God's love in your heart, all you're really saying is that you're experiencing some intense emotional sensation that is unique from others. You therefore give it a name, and that name is God. So you'll notice that simply saying, I feel God, has no more meaning than to say, I feel itchy or I smell coffee. It's just a sensation being given a label. So no, Christians, that just doesn't fly. That's cheating. Next, I'd like to draw attention to a special class of incorrigible propositions called assignment declarations. So as a corollary to axiom number 2, we're now going to state that all assignment declarations are true. And what I mean by this is any assertion of basic definitions or labels, substitutions, symbolic notation is all true. So for example, I might say something like, I define bachelor as unmarried man. Right? This is just me stating my intention of word usage. Or perhaps I can be more technical and say something like, let x equal y and y equal z. Again, these are just incorrigible statements. I am free within the bounds of my own little internal reality to assign whatever words, syllables, and symbolic notation however I like. It's called language. It's a mental tool that allows me to encapsulate my experiences and thoughts and perceptions within a layer of verbal abstraction. So if I'm going to get anywhere at all through this process, then my ability to assign labels needs to be a valid operation. And that's all this corollary says, that it's just okay to make use of language for its intended purpose. Of course, there is a catch, and that is other people are not necessarily bound to use my same abstractions when expressing their own ideas. I mean, just because I happen to define bachelor as unmarried man, that does not mean everyone else has to do it as well. And in fact, this is why so much of practical philosophy itself is spent simply defining our terms to each other. I mean, if I build these huge mountains of abstraction into my ideas that other people are not familiar with, then I might as well just be speaking a different language. So if you expect to get anywhere in basic conversation, then always make sure that other people can follow your use of language. All right, with that in mind, we now have our third axiom, which states that all assignment declarations are transitive. This is basically just a follow-up to the previous axiom about my use of language. It's one thing to merely declare my intended definition of some word, and then it's another thing entirely to actually implement it in a proposition. So what transitivity says is basically the following. Given two propositions, x and y, if x is true and x equals y, then y is also true. And likewise, if x is false, then y would also be false. You'll notice that this is actually our first deductive statement. That is, given two propositions that are true, it is possible to create a new original proposition that is also true. So an example of this might look like the following. Proposition 1. Tim is an unmarried man. That is simply assumed to be true. I could then say, I define bachelor as unmarried man. That would be an incorrigible declaration of assignment. Then, by transitivity, it would follow that Tim is a bachelor. So you can see that I now have a functional set of linguistic tools which allow me to build layers of abstraction on my sense experiences. And as long as other people are generally using the same words and definitions as I am, then I can effectively communicate myself with others. So all this axiom is effectively doing at the end of the day is establishing the rules for effective use of language. And obviously I need language in order to formulate propositions, so therefore these operations deserve to be true. Next, we have axiom number 4, which follows the same theme by stating that all incoherent propositions are false. Or in other words, if I don't know what the hell you're talking about, then whatever it is you're claiming is obviously useless to me. For example, if someone were to come to me with a proposition that says, blarg, snargle, herbal twip, all right, what am I supposed to make of that? Or maybe you remember that line from Monty Python, which says, eki, patang, zuboing, zumnam. All right, that's a proposition too, isn't it? So is that statement true or false? Well, obviously it's gibberish. It's a bunch of random sounds strung together without any meaningful function or idea behind them. So since I can't do anything with that kind of a proposition, then by default, I'm just going to declare it to be false. However, bear in mind that this axiom actually goes a lot further than that. For example, if someone were to say, colorless green sleeps furiously, that is a perfectly correct sentence as far as grammar is concerned, and even the words themselves have individual meanings. But taken as a whole, the entire sentence just collapses into a mess of meaningless gibberish again. Like, how exactly does anything sleep furiously? Now, to be fair, maybe you have some assignment declaration that gives meaning to these statements. For example, maybe furious sleep is just another way of saying deep sleep, and that's okay. Now you're giving it meaning, and there are rules for engaging that process. But until we can establish how those words fit together, they're just going to fail to relate to anything I can understand. So until that issue is fixed, this proposition will remain incoherent and therefore false. All right, moving along, we now have axiom number 5, which says all valid epistemic conclusions are true. For example, if I have a proposition X and I feed it into my epistemic system, I might get a label of true. Therefore, I might be inclined to say that X is true. But notice how that statement is yet another proposition unto itself. So what am I supposed to do with that? Again, I have to give it some label, and it doesn't make sense to say that it's false. So by axiom number 5, we'll just simply declare it to be true. So it is true that X is true. This might seem like tedious bookkeeping at first, but there's actually a very important reason for this. Because you'll notice that if we keep going with this operation, we have a sort of infinite regress problem. If it's true that X is true, then is that proposition true? Or what about the truth after that? Or the truth of the truth of the truth after that, and after that? So all axiom number 5 says is that, yes, they're all true, just stop wasting my time. That way, I don't have to worry about issues that are already settled. In fact, when you look at it the right way, you can almost think of this as a form of logical identity, that maybe you could phrase it as all true propositions are true. So for example, if Tim is a bachelor, then it is true that Tim is a bachelor. Right? That's just the law of identity from classical logic. And we can do a lot with this kind of proposition, so therefore I need these statements to be true. Now we could keep going with more axioms, but at this point I just want to stop and take a look back at what we've accomplished so far. When you really think about it, all we've done is acknowledge 3 important points. First, we've acknowledged that truth is just a label given to propositions in accordance with conditional rules. That's why we need axioms to be true in our epistemology. Secondly, I experience an immediate mental awareness with sensory data. I may not know where it comes from or what causes it, but it's there for me to see, and so I might as well just take it for what it is. Thirdly, part of my immediate sensory experience is a capacity for using language to say things and express my ideas. So any effort in that regard is again simply taken at face value. But notice how all of these principles are entirely contained within my own little internal reality. Even with all of these fancy axioms, I still have yet to say anything about the external world beyond my senses. This is just me playing games with rules and definitions. Now, in philosophy, there's actually a word for these types of propositions, and we call these analytic propositions, or in some circles, a priori knowledge. These are just things that I can absolutely know to be true simply by using language. And what people consistently fail to understand is that there's nothing magical or platonic or transcendent about any of this. I'm just giving words to my mental awareness. Yet, this fact alone is responsible for huge fields of human study. All logical systems, all mathematical frameworks, and even many games exist purely by definitional fiat and axiomatic assertion. Yet, for some odd reason, there are a lot of people fighting very hard against this simple observation. And I think it's likely because they have a sort of naive Platonic view about truth. So what they try to do is interpret things like mathematics and logic as if they were some kind of nebulous essence of the cosmos itself. But of course, that's just not how it works. So for example, what I'm showing you here are 3 basic laws of classical logic. And you'll notice that these are just, again, rules built on definitions, which are contained entirely within language itself. In particular, these rules exist in order to help me combine singular propositions together into larger, more complicated propositions. Yet, from these simple definitions, I can actually derive as theorems notable things like the law of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle. They just fall out of the words themselves. It's important to realize that the only reason we like logic is because it provides us with a rigorous, formalized structure for talking about the world in a meaningful way. So if you choose to follow these rules, then you are simply being logical. And if you choose not to follow these rules, well, then you're simply not being logical anymore. And no matter how disciplined you may be in following those rules, pure, unfettered logic cannot in and of itself ever tell you anything about external reality. At best, it merely tells you whether or not you are expressing yourself correctly. This finally brings us to the real meat of our discussion, namely, how do we go about formulating propositions about the external world beyond our senses? And philosophers again have a word for this, and these are called synthetic propositions, or in some circles, a posteriori knowledge. Right, examples of this might look like, say, some bachelors are bald, or perhaps sound is produced by vibrations in air, right? Things like that. These are synthetic propositions. But the big question is, how do we go about measuring their truth? I mean, we have all these great axioms, but none of them yet help me in this area. So what we need is another axiom to help us measure the truth of synthetic propositions. And this, I think, is where our pragmatic maxim really finally begins to shine. So our final axiom for today is going to look like this. Axiom number 6. For any synthetic proposition P, there exists an action A and expected consequence C to that action. If P is true, then doing A will lead to C. Or equivalently, if we take the contrapositive, if doing A fails to produce C, then P is false. So how does this work? Well, let's do an example. So let's suppose I make the claim that all bachelors are bald. Right, that would be a synthetic proposition. But that being the case, there necessarily exists some action I could take to verify this claim, like investigate the heads of bachelors in the world. And if P is true, then the expected consequence is that I will never observe a single known bachelor with hair on his head. So if you then present me with, say, Tim the Bachelor, and I investigate Tim's head for hair, and I indeed observe hair, then P would obviously be false. Now, to be fair, there are definitely certain caveats to this process. Like, for example, how can you be absolutely sure that Tim really is a bachelor and not maybe lying? Or even if you really were sure, how do you know that he really has hair as opposed to maybe just wearing a toupee? Right, these are good questions, but the answers are an entirely separate discussion unto themselves. In the meantime, I just want everyone to at least see how the core process of basic pragmatism is intended to work with regard to synthetic propositions. Now, before wrapping up, I just want to draw attention to a really important observation. Because what makes this axiom so awesome is that it actually contains 3 of the great pillars of science all in one little box. For instance, we have empiricism, which says that when it comes to synthetic propositions, you can't just use pure reason alone. You have to produce some meaningful sensory experiences in order to have validity. Next, we have tentativism, which says that no claim about the external world is ever absolutely true, and so therefore always open to doubt and scrutiny in the face of newer information. Then finally, we have falsifiability, which says that although we can't ever prove anything true about the external world, we can prove many things false. So the way we make progress in science is by continually disproving everything we can until whatever is left over eventually starts to resemble some real metaphysical truth with a capital T. So in effect, you can even see how this helps us to solve the classic demarcation problem between what is science and what is non-science, because any process that fails to utilize one of these pillars is necessarily unscientific by definition. Okay, finally, as a closing remark, I just want to emphasize some important points about these axioms. First off, none of these axioms are set in stone, so to speak. Or if you have a better formulation of these axioms that's more expressive and more useful, then great, bring it out here, let's hear it. Secondly, there is no reason why we have to absolutely restrict ourselves to this whole true-false dichotomy. Maybe you think we need a third category, like neither or I don't know. And in fact, there's a whole field of study for this exact case, and it's called tri-state logic. I mean, go look it up sometime. Or better yet, maybe you don't even like the idea of hard epistemic labels, but instead you want to deal with more of a continuum of truth. So there's actually a name for that too, and it's called fuzzy logic. But remember that when all is said and done, I just need to make functional decisions in the real world with real consequences. So if you can't help me with that, then by definition, your epistemology is useless, and I don't care. Okay, on that note, in closing, I hope you found this lecture useful to your understanding of truth and epistemology. So I know I've had fun putting them together, and I have a great time hearing your thoughts and ideas. So please do feel free to join the discussion and help me refine these principles for future videos. This is deep philosophical stuff and maybe even a little dry at times, but hopefully you can also see that this has important relevance to the way in which we approach controversial issues that affect our lives. So thank you for watching.